I need you to sign your inheritance over to your brother today, my mother said before my grandmother's will was even opened. Why was everyone acting like the money already belonged to Tyler? Why did Grandma's attorney keep glancing at one sealed envelope instead of the will itself? And why had Grandma told me just weeks before she passed, "Don't let anyone rush you into a decision"? Tyler leaned forward and called me selfish for hesitating. I looked at the unopened envelope resting beside the will and quietly said, before anyone asks me to give away a single dollar, let's read Grandma Eleanor's exact words. If you're watching from outside the U.S., I'd love to know where you're joining from. Tell me your country and what time it is where you are right now. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice and standing your ground, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and stay with me until the end of Shelby's story. Richard Lawson adjusted his glasses and looked around the conference room before saying, "Before we continue with the formal reading, Mrs. Dean left instructions that everyone should understand the context behind several provisions in her estate plan." My mother shifted impatiently in her chair. "Is all of that really necessary?" Patricia asked. "We're family. We already know what Mother wanted." Richard offered the same calm expression he'd worn since we'd arrived. "Mrs. Dean specifically instructed me that it was." Those words settled over the room like heavy rain. As I waited for him to continue, my mind drifted backward through the years to moments that suddenly made far more sense than they ever had before. If someone had met me 10 years earlier, they probably would have described me as the dependable daughter. I graduated from college with student loans because my grandmother believed education mattered, but my parents insisted they couldn't contribute much financially. I accepted that. I worked evenings at a bookstore, spent weekends tutoring high school students, and learned how to stretch every paycheck. At 28, I bought my first townhouse outside Charlotte. It wasn't large. The kitchen needed updating, and the backyard was barely big enough for a grill and 2 chairs. But every payment came from money I earned. When I invited my family over for dinner after moving in, my mother hugged me and smiled proudly. Then Tyler arrived 40 minutes late. He had another business idea. That sentence became almost a family tradition. There had been a mobile detailing company, a gourmet food truck, an online fitness subscription, a custom furniture startup. Each one came with enthusiastic presentations, colorful spreadsheets, ambitious promises, and explanations about why this attempt would finally change everything. Each one also ended the same way. Unexpected expenses, bad partners, market conditions, investors who didn't understand the vision. There was always a reason. There was rarely accountability. Every failure became someone else's responsibility, usually my mother's, or Grandma Eleanor's, or whichever relative still believed one more loan might be the one that helped Tyler finally succeed. I remember one Thanksgiving when Tyler announced that a supplier had unexpectedly backed out of a deal. "I just need $30,000 to bridge the gap," he said, while passing the mashed potatoes as casually as if he were asking someone to refill his water. Nobody even looked surprised. Instead, everyone looked toward my mother. Patricia sighed dramatically. "I don't have that kind of money." Tyler lowered his head. "I guess I'll lose everything." Then came the silence. The kind of silence designed to make someone feel responsible. Finally, my aunt asked, "Maybe everyone could contribute a little." Grandma Eleanor quietly changed the subject. At the time, I thought she simply wanted to avoid an argument. Years later, I realized she had probably seen the pattern far more clearly than the rest of us. Tyler eventually found the money. I never learned exactly where it came from. No one volunteered the information. I didn't ask. That was another unspoken rule in our family. Don't question financial rescues. Just appreciate that the crisis is over. My own emergencies received very different responses. When my air conditioner failed during one of North Carolina's hottest summers, I paid for the replacement myself. When Ethan and I replaced our roof after a hailstorm, we rearranged our budget. When I lost a promotion I had spent months preparing for, nobody offered financial help because I didn't ask for it. And honestly, I never expected it. What I did expect was equal standards. That never happened. Whenever Tyler struggled, everyone gathered around him. Whenever I succeeded, people congratulated me before immediately reminding me how fortunate I was. "You're lucky you always land on your feet," my mother often said. The truth was much less glamorous. I planned. I saved. I lived below my means. I spent years working in financial compliance, reviewing internal controls, identifying risks, and making sure organizations followed regulations before problems became disasters. The work wasn't exciting. Most people couldn't explain what I actually did. Tyler certainly couldn't. Once he joked during a family barbecue, "Shelby gets paid to tell people to fill out paperwork." Everyone laughed. I smiled too. Correcting him didn't seem worth the effort. Grandma Eleanor, however, looked directly at me. "I imagine paperwork keeps a lot of people from making very expensive mistakes." I smiled back. "It usually does." She nodded once. I thought so. That exchange lasted maybe 15 seconds. Looking back now, I think she understood my work far better than anyone else in the family. As the years passed, Ethan became increasingly aware of how different my relationship with my family was from the one he had with his own parents. After almost every holiday dinner, we'd drive home quietly for several minutes before he finally asked the same question. "Are you okay?" I usually answered yes. Sometimes I even believed it. One Christmas Eve, after Tyler announced another investment opportunity that required immediate funding, Ethan waited until we reached our driveway before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Has anyone ever asked Tyler to solve one of your problems?" I laughed softly. "No." "Has anyone ever expected him to sacrifice for you?" I thought about it. "No." "Then why is the opposite treated like a family tradition?" I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Grandma Eleanor invited me to lunch about once every month. We rarely discussed money directly. Instead, she'd ask simple questions. "How's work?" "What are you saving for these days?" "Do you still balance your accounts every Friday?" I always assumed she enjoyed practical conversations. Now I think she was quietly checking something much deeper. She wanted to know whether I still trusted my own judgment. One afternoon, about 8 months before she passed away, she invited me onto her back porch after lunch. She handed me sweet tea and watched the birds gather near the feeder. Then she asked something unexpected. "If someone you loved asked you to make a financial decision that didn't feel right, what would you do?" I laughed. "Probably overthink it." She smiled. "I know you would." Then her expression became more serious. "Promise me something." "What?" "Never confuse love with financial access." I remember blinking. "I don't think I understand." "You don't need to today." She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "The people who truly love you won't need you to prove it with your bank account." I carried those words home without fully understanding them. Over the following months, Grandma occasionally mentioned organizing old files. She joked that she'd accumulated enough paperwork to keep an accountant busy for years. I offered to help. She thanked me but declined. "I need to do this myself." At the time, I assumed she was simply organizing family history. I had no idea she was carefully documenting financial history as well. After her funeral, Richard Lawson called me to confirm the date for the estate meeting. Just before ending the call, he added one sentence. Mrs. Dean left more documentation than most people do. I thought he meant property records, insurance papers, investment accounts. Nothing unusual. Now sitting inside his conference room, I watched him unlock a leather portfolio thicker than any ordinary estate file. He carefully removed several folders, each labeled in Grandma Eleanor's unmistakably neat handwriting. Patricia frowned. "What on earth is all of that?" Richard looked at every person seated around the table before answering. "Mrs. Dean instructed me to present every attachment exactly as she organized it." He placed one folder beside the will, then another, then another. Finally, he rested his hand on the last sealed packet. "This estate," he said quietly, "contains several supporting exhibits that Mrs. Dean considered essential to understanding her final decisions." No one spoke. Even Tyler stopped fidgeting. Richard picked up the first attachment and looked directly at us. "The reading of the will cannot continue until these exhibits are introduced." Richard waited until the room was completely still before opening the first folder. "I want to remind everyone," he began, "that my responsibility today is not to interpret Mrs. Eleanor Dean's wishes. My responsibility is to read them exactly as she wrote them." He looked first at my mother, then at Tyler, and finally at me. "Mrs. Dean was very clear about that." Patricia folded her arms. "I understand legal procedure, Richard." His polite smile never changed. "I'm glad to hear that." He unfolded the original will. Unlike the dramatic courtroom scenes people see in movies, a real estate reading is surprisingly methodical. Every paragraph is deliberate. Every legal description is precise. Richard moved slowly, making sure every sentence was understood before continuing. He first confirmed that all outstanding debts, taxes, and funeral expenses had already been paid. Then came the personal belongings. Grandma Eleanor had left her wedding ring to my cousin Amanda. Her collection of gardening journals went to the local botanical society. Her church quilt was donated to the women's outreach ministry she'd volunteered with for nearly 20 years. She even left her old pickup truck to a retired neighbor who had helped maintain her property after Grandpa died. Every gift reflected a relationship. Nothing felt random. I found myself smiling despite everything. It sounded exactly like Grandma. Thoughtful, organized, intentional. Richard turned another page. "The remaining investment accounts and liquid assets are to be divided according to Schedule A." Patricia leaned slightly forward. Tyler straightened in his chair. No one interrupted. The house had already been sold months before Grandma passed away because she could no longer manage the maintenance. She had chosen assisted living during her final year, and the proceeds from the sale had been invested alongside her retirement savings. Richard listed every account one by one. Certificates of deposit, investment funds, savings accounts, treasury securities. Everything had been documented with remarkable detail. Then came the distribution. Several charitable organizations received fixed gifts. The church received a modest donation. Each grandchild received family keepsakes chosen specifically for them. Tyler and I were both beneficiaries of the remaining estate. The percentages surprised no one. They were equal. Patricia let out a small breath of relief. I recognized that expression immediately. She wasn't relieved because Grandma had treated us fairly. She was relieved because she believed fairness wouldn't matter for very long. In her mind, I would simply give my share to Tyler. Problem solved. She actually smiled. "See?" she said, looking toward me instead of Richard. "Your grandmother loved both of you equally." Tyler nodded confidently. "I told you." Neither of them seemed interested in letting Richard finish. He cleared his throat gently. I'm afraid we're not finished." Patricia looked confused. "The assets have already been divided." "Yes. So that's the end?" "No." Richard reached for another document clipped behind the will. Mrs. Dean included additional instructions that become effective immediately upon distribution. The atmosphere changed. Even the air seemed heavier. Richard adjusted the papers carefully. "This section is titled—" He paused just long enough to confirm the wording. "Instructions to be read before any beneficiary transfers gifts, loans, assignments, or renunciations of estate assets." No one moved. I heard Tyler exhale through his nose. Patricia frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Richard answered calmly, "Mrs. Dean anticipated the possibility that one beneficiary could be pressured to surrender or transfer inherited assets." Silence. Absolute silence. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Tyler laughed awkwardly. "Well, that's pretty specific." Richard didn't respond. Instead, he continued reading. "No beneficiary should make any financial commitment regarding inherited property until every attached document has been reviewed in full." Patricia's smile disappeared. She looked at me, then at Tyler, then back to Richard. "This seems unnecessary." Richard continued as though she hadn't spoken. "Family harmony built upon financial sacrifice is temporary. Family relationships built upon honesty are lasting." I knew those words. Grandma had said something very similar to me once while we planted tomatoes in her backyard. At the time, I thought she was talking about gardening. Now I realized she had been preparing me for something else entirely. Richard carefully removed another envelope. Unlike the official will, this one was cream-colored. Across the front, written in Grandma Eleanor's unmistakable cursive, were 6 words. "For my family to hear together." Patricia stared at it. "I've never seen that before." Richard nodded. "No one had." He broke the wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter spanning several pages. The paper itself looked ordinary. The weight it carried did not. Richard unfolded the first page. Before reading, he looked around the room. "Mrs. Dean requested that no one interrupt until the letter has been completed." Tyler shifted impatiently. "This feels dramatic." Richard answered without irritation. "I didn't write it." He lowered his eyes to the page. "If you are hearing this letter," he read, "then I am no longer able to explain these decisions myself." The room became perfectly still. "I have loved every member of this family with all my heart. Because I love you, I cannot leave behind confusion disguised as kindness." Patricia blinked rapidly. I watched her hands tighten around her purse. Richard continued. "Throughout my life, I have learned that fairness is often mistaken for favoritism by the person who expects more than everyone else." Tyler crossed his arms. "That's just Grandma's opinion." Richard kept reading. "One of my grandchildren has spent years believing responsibility is simply part of adulthood. Another has spent years believing someone else will always soften the consequences of poor decisions." No names. None were needed. Everyone knew. Patricia spoke before she could stop herself. "Mother," Richard gently raised one hand, "Mrs. Dean specifically instructed there be no interruptions." Patricia lowered her eyes. For the first time since arriving, she looked uncertain. Richard resumed. "Neither child was born this way. Families teach these habits often without realizing it." That sentence landed differently. It didn't accuse. It observed. Grandma wasn't attacking anyone. She was describing a pattern. Richard reached the bottom of the page. "Patricia!" He stopped briefly. My mother looked up. "If you are listening, I hope you hear these next words as your mother, not as your judge." Patricia's face lost its color. She whispered almost involuntarily, "Mom." Richard continued reading. "You have confused rescuing with loving. You have carried Tyler's burdens for so long that you no longer recognize which burdens belong to him. Tyler shifted in his chair. This isn't fair. Nobody answered him. Richard read on. You have also expected Shelby's strength to compensate for Tyler's weakness. That was never Shelby's responsibility. I didn't realize I had stopped breathing until Ethan's words from years earlier echoed in my mind. Has anyone ever expected Tyler to sacrifice for you? Grandma had seen it. All of it. Years before I had finally admitted it to myself. Richard turned the page. There were still several pages remaining. He looked toward us before continuing. Mrs. Dean attached references supporting each statement made in this letter. Patricia frowned. What do you mean references? Without saying a word, Richard reached into the portfolio again. He removed a thick stack of photocopied documents. Each bundle was labeled with a date. Each was attached to a numbered exhibit. Loan records, canceled checks, signed promissory notes, personal ledger entries, handwritten journal pages. Every sentence in Grandma's letter pointed to documented evidence. This wasn't simply an emotional farewell. She had built it like an audit. Richard placed the first evidence packet on the table. There are 12 supporting exhibits. Tyler's confident expression finally began to crack. He stared at the stack, then slowly looked at our mother. For the first time that afternoon, neither of them seemed certain what Grandma Eleanor had left behind. No one reached for the documents. For several long seconds, the only sound in Richard Lawson's conference room was the soft hum of the air conditioner. My mother finally broke the silence. I don't understand why Mother felt the need to do all this, Richard answered carefully. Mrs. Dean anticipated that question. He opened another page of Grandma Eleanor's letter. If you are wondering why I documented so much, he read, it is because memories become flexible when money is involved. Paper rarely does. No one laughed. Tyler leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. So Grandma kept records on everybody. Richard nodded. Yes. Then why are we only hearing about mine? Richard looked directly at him. We aren't. He picked up the first exhibit. This folder contains records involving every major financial gift Mrs. Dean personally witnessed or participated in over the last 21 years. He slid copies toward each of us. I looked down at mine. Every page had been organized with Grandma's familiar handwriting, dates, amounts, who received the money, whether repayment had been promised, whether repayment had actually occurred. Cross-references pointed to canceled checks, bank statements, handwritten notes, and in several cases signed agreements. It looked less like a family scrapbook and more like the audit files I reviewed at work. Grandma had built evidence, not accusations. Evidence. Richard continued reading from her letter. My goal is not to embarrass anyone. My goal is to prevent future arguments by replacing opinions with facts. I felt a lump form in my throat. That sounded exactly like her. She never enjoyed confrontation. She simply believed problems became smaller when everyone agreed on reality. Patricia began flipping through the pages. I don't remember some of these, Richard replied gently. Mrs. Dean expected that. He pointed to another paragraph. If anyone says they do not remember these events, I understand. That is another reason I wrote them down while they were happening. Tyler suddenly reached across the table and picked up one of the exhibits. What's this? Richard checked the number. Exhibit 4. Tyler scanned it quickly. His confidence faded almost immediately. This isn't relevant. Richard didn't respond. I looked at my own copy. The exhibit described a loan Grandma Eleanor had given Tyler 12 years earlier to purchase equipment for his first business. Attached behind it was the canceled check. Then came Tyler's signed promise to repay the money within 18 months. Behind that was Grandma's handwritten note made 2 years later. No repayment received. Tyler says business failed. I chose not to ask again because Patricia begged me not to. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Tyler cleared his throat. "That was a long time ago," Richard quietly said. Mrs. Dean included only records she believed remained relevant to understanding family expectations. Patricia quickly came to Tyler's defense. "He was young. He was 22, Richard answered after checking the document. "He made mistakes. No one disputes that." His calmness somehow made every response heavier. Patricia looked frustrated. "People deserve second chances." Richard nodded. "They do. Third chances. Sometimes. Fourth chances." He smiled politely. "I believe Mrs. Dean addressed that." He resumed reading. "I have never objected to helping Tyler after honest mistakes. I objected only when helping became expected rather than appreciated." Tyler looked away. Richard turned another page. Each rescue became easier to request and harder to refuse. The words settled heavily over the table. Because they were true. I remembered birthdays where conversations somehow ended with someone discussing Tyler's finances, Christmas dinners that became fundraising meetings, family reunions where everyone quietly compared notes about whether Tyler had repaid old loans. No one ever called it enabling. They called it supporting family. Grandma had apparently called it something else. Richard continued. "Support should help someone become independent. If support creates dependence, it has changed into something different." I glanced toward my mother. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked tired, really tired, as though she had suddenly realized how many years these patterns had stretched across. Then Richard reached Exhibit 7. "This exhibit concerns distributions made by Mrs. Dean personally." He passed around another packet. Inside was a simple summary sheet. Over 21 years, Grandma Eleanor had financially assisted various relatives. Most of the entries were modest. Helping an aunt replace a furnace, paying for a cousin's emergency surgery deductible, contributing toward another cousin's nursing school tuition. Then came Tyler's section. The list continued across 3 full pages. Business startup, emergency payroll, equipment replacement, rent assistance, vehicle repair, legal fees, credit card consolidation, bridge financing, tax payment, inventory purchase, emergency operating expenses. Even without adding the numbers together, the pattern was obvious. Tyler stared silently at the pages. Patricia finally whispered, "I didn't realize." Richard looked at her. Mrs. Dean totaled the amounts. He turned the page. At the bottom sat one handwritten figure. $487,300. No one spoke. My inheritance was less than half of that amount. I didn't need a calculator. Tyler had already received more than twice what Grandma was leaving me. Patricia slowly shook her head. "That can't be right." Richard reached into the folder. "It includes supporting documentation. Canceled checks, wire confirmations, bank withdrawal slips, copies of cashier's checks. Everything matched. Grandma hadn't estimated. She had documented." Tyler rubbed both hands across his face. "A lot of that wasn't just for me." Richard waited. "It helped employees. It helped suppliers. It kept businesses alive." Richard nodded. Mrs. Dean acknowledged that. He pointed toward another note. I read Grandma's handwriting. "Businesses may fail honestly. The concern is not failure. The concern is expecting the next rescue before accepting responsibility for the previous one." That sentence hit harder than any accusation could have. Because it wasn't cruel. It was measured, objective. Patricia suddenly looked at me. You knew about this, I honestly answered. No. You never saw these records? No. She searched my face for several seconds. Apparently she believed me, because I looked exactly how I felt. Stunned. Grandma had trusted me, but she hadn't shown me her evidence. She had wanted it discovered after she was gone, not used while she was alive. Richard folded his hands. There is another attachment, Patricia sighed. There's more, yes. He lifted a slim envelope marked Exhibit 9. This one contains correspondence Mrs. Dean exchanged with her financial advisor. Tyler groaned. Seriously? Richard ignored the interruption. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside were several typed letters along with handwritten annotations from Grandma. One paragraph had been highlighted. Richard read it aloud. I am concerned that future gifts to Tyler will no longer function as assistance, but as an expectation. Therefore, I intend to preserve sufficient assets for Shelby because she has quietly subsidized the family in ways few people have noticed. I frowned. Quietly subsidized. What did that mean? I had never given Tyler large sums of money, never financed one of his companies, never guaranteed his loans. Richard noticed my expression. I believe Mrs. Dean anticipated that question as well. He removed one final page attached behind the advisor's letter. It wasn't addressed to my mother, or Tyler, or the family. It was addressed specifically to me. Across the top in Grandma Eleanor's handwriting were 6 words that made my stomach tighten. Shelby, you never knew this part. I stared at the page without touching it. For the first time that afternoon, Richard looked directly at me instead of the room. Mrs. Dean instructed that this letter be read only after everyone had reviewed the previous exhibits. My mother looked exhausted. Tyler looked irritated. I simply felt confused. What could Grandma possibly know that I didn't? Richard unfolded the page. Shelby, he began. If Richard is reading this, it means the rest of the family has already seen enough evidence to understand that this letter is not about blame. It is about truth. I swallowed. There is something you never realized because I chose not to burden you with it while I was alive. Richard paused only long enough to turn the page. For years, you believed you never contributed financially to your brother's businesses. You were wrong, but not because you made that choice. I looked up. What? Richard continued. Several times your sacrifices became Tyler's opportunities, and you were never told. The room went perfectly still. Patricia slowly looked toward Richard. What is she talking about? He reached for another folder. This is the material Mrs. Dean asked me to present next. Across the tab were the words, Exhibit 10, Indirect Family Contributions. I frowned. Indirect? Richard nodded. Mrs. Dean defined that term very carefully. He opened the folder. The first example occurred when Shelby graduated from college. I immediately recognized the date. It was the year I accepted my first job, the year my student loans entered repayment. Grandma's note explained everything in her neat handwriting. When Shelby graduated, Patricia and I discussed helping her eliminate part of her student debt. Patricia asked me to postpone because Tyler urgently needed capital for his first business. She promised we would revisit Shelby's situation the following year. We never did. I slowly lowered the page. I had never known that conversation happened. Not once. Not ever. My mother stared at the document. She couldn't finish. Richard quietly continued. The following year. Another note. Another date. Grandma had wanted to help me with a down payment after I became pre-approved for my townhouse. Instead, Tyler's furniture company lost a major contract. The money went to emergency operating expenses. Again. No one told me. I remembered calling Grandma that summer. I'd been excited. I found a little townhouse. She had sounded genuinely happy. I knew you would. I had joked that my savings account looked painfully small. She laughed. You'll manage. I always thought she simply believed in my independence. Now I realized she had already watched the money she'd hoped to give me disappear into another rescue. Across the table, Patricia covered her mouth. I didn't think, Richard gently answered. Mrs. Dean anticipated that reaction. He resumed reading. Patricia believed Shelby would succeed without assistance because Shelby always had before. She believed Tyler would collapse without assistance because experience suggested he might. She convinced herself that postponing help for Shelby was harmless because Shelby rarely complained. Every sentence hurt because none of it sounded malicious. It sounded rational. That was what made it dangerous, not cruelty. Justifications. Years of them. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. Mom didn't steal anything. No one has used that word, Richard replied. Then why are we acting like she did? Richard folded his hands. We're examining patterns, not accusations. Tyler looked at me. You turned out fine. I met his eye. That's not the point. It kind of is. No. For the first time all afternoon, I spoke without carefully choosing softer words. The point isn't whether I survived. Neither of us looked away. The point is that everyone decided surviving meant I needed less. Silence. Tyler blinked. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Very tired. Richard continued before anyone else could speak. The next document concerns a family vacation. I immediately remembered it. 15 years earlier, our entire extended family had rented a beach house in South Carolina. Everyone talked for months about how wonderful it would be. 3 weeks before the trip, I canceled. My transmission failed. Repairing my car cost nearly $4,000. I couldn't afford both. Grandma had called me the night before everyone left. I'll miss you. I know. We'll bring you seashells. I laughed. Deal. I never questioned why she sounded disappointed. Now I understood. Grandma's note explained that she had offered to reimburse my repair bill so I could still attend. Patricia convinced her not to. Tyler's restaurant concept needed commercial kitchen equipment immediately. The money went there instead. I closed my eyes. I had spent that week eating frozen dinners after work while everyone else posted smiling family photos from the beach. I told myself adulthood meant making difficult choices. Apparently, the choice had never really been mine. Patricia whispered, I honestly believed we'd replace it. Grandma's handwritten annotation sat beneath that statement. Promises to repay future fairness eventually become permission to avoid fairness altogether. I recognized the ink. She had added that line years later, probably after realizing repayment never happened. Richard placed another document on the table. This one is different. It wasn't a financial record. It was 1 page, typed, signed, prepared by Grandma's longtime accountant. A summary. Over 21 years, opportunities postponed or declined because family funds were redirected toward Tyler totaled approximately $214,000 in intended assistance for Shelby. Not guaranteed gifts, not legal obligations, simply opportunities that disappeared. I stared at the number, not because of the amount, because I had lived my entire adult life believing nobody had ever considered helping me. Grandma had, repeatedly. She just lost every argument. Patricia quietly began crying. I never wanted Shelby to think she mattered less. Richard answered softly. I don't believe Mrs. Dean thought you intended that. He looked down and read another paragraph. Intent matters. Outcomes matter too. Children live with outcomes. Nobody moved. The words settled over us one by one. I suddenly remembered dozens of conversations that had seemed harmless at the time. You're so responsible. You don't really need help. You'll figure something out. You've always been independent. I used to hear compliments. Now I heard assumptions. Assumptions that quietly cost me opportunities. Tyler leaned forward. So what now? Richard looked at him. There are still 2 remaining exhibits. Tyler let out an impatient breath. More paperwork. Richard didn't react. The next exhibit concerns your current company. Tyler frowned immediately. My business. Yes. Grandma died before I even launched it. Richard nodded once. She anticipated that as well. Tyler laughed nervously. That's impossible. Richard opened the final folder in front of him. Instead of old handwritten notes, the contents were recent. Very recent. Public corporate filings, business registration records, financing disclosures, operating agreements, all dated within the previous 3 months. I looked at Richard. Grandma couldn't have collected these. No. Who did? Richard carefully closed the folder. Mrs. Dean instructed another professional to continue assembling documentation after her passing if certain conditions occurred. Every person at the table looked at him. He slid a business card across the polished wood. It belonged to Grandma Eleanor's longtime accountant. Below his signature was a handwritten note. Richard, if Tyler asks Shelby for her inheritance to finance another business, please share everything. He'll understand why when the time comes. The accountant has already completed the remaining file. Richard rested his hand on the thick folder. I believe, he said quietly, it's time we discuss Tyler's newest business venture. No one spoke. Tyler looked at the folder as though simply refusing to acknowledge it might make it disappear. That's ridiculous, he finally said. My business has nothing to do with Grandma's estate. Richard Lawson rested both hands on the table. Ordinarily, I would agree. He opened the folder. But Mrs. Dean instructed her accountant to monitor only one thing after her passing. He found the first page. Whether any beneficiary attempted to obtain another beneficiary's inheritance before probate concluded. Patricia slowly turned toward Tyler. You told me you hadn't asked Shelby for anything until today. Tyler hesitated. I hadn't. Richard quietly slid the first document across the table. It appears otherwise. It was a copy of Tyler's Articles of Organization filed with the North Carolina Secretary of State. Nothing unusual. Then came the operating agreement. Again, nothing unusual at first glance. Richard flipped to a highlighted paragraph. Please read the highlighted section. Tyler frowned. I'm not reading legal paperwork in front of everybody. I'll read it then. Richard adjusted his glasses. Founder expects additional family capital contribution following estate distribution currently pending. Funds anticipated within approximately 30 days of probate commencement. The room fell silent. My mother looked confused. What does that mean? I already knew. Richard answered anyway. It means Mr. Dean represented to other parties that additional capital was expected from family inheritance. Tyler immediately leaned forward. It says expected. Correct. It doesn't say guaranteed. Also correct. So what's the issue? Richard looked at him steadily. The issue is whether investors were led to believe funding was more certain than it actually was. Tyler crossed his arms. I believed Shelby would help. You believed, Richard repeated calmly. Yes. Did Shelby ever promise she would? No. Did she authorize you to represent her inheritance as expected capital? Tyler didn't answer. Richard waited. Finally, he muttered no. Patricia looked at her son in disbelief. You already counted Shelby's inheritance. It wasn't like that. Then explain it. He rubbed the back of his neck. I was optimistic. I had heard that word my entire adult life. Optimistic. It always seemed to arrive moments before someone else was expected to absorb the consequences. Richard opened the next exhibit. This is correspondence supplied by Mrs. Dean's accountant. The accountant Samuel Whitmore had known Grandma for nearly 30 years. His memorandum explained that Eleanor had contacted him 6 months before her death. She hadn't asked him to investigate Tyler. She had asked him to safeguard the truth if another funding request appeared after she was gone. Samuel wrote that because many business records are public, he could lawfully preserve copies if specific events occurred. Those events were listed: if Tyler forms another company, if Tyler seeks investors, if Tyler requests Shelby's inheritance, if family members pressure Shelby before probate concludes. Every box had been checked. Patricia slowly whispered she knew. Richard gently corrected her. I don't believe Mrs. Dean knew. He tapped the memorandum. I believe she understood the pattern. There was a difference. One required predicting the future. The other required recognizing behavior that had repeated for decades. As someone who worked in compliance, I understood exactly what Grandma had done. Companies don't build internal controls because they know who will commit fraud. They build them because repeated patterns create predictable risks. Grandma hadn't predicted Tyler. She had documented him. Richard continued. There is another document. This one came directly from Samuel Whitmore. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply a timeline. Business 1. Family assistance received. Business closed. Business 2. Additional family assistance. Business dissolved. Business 3. Emergency funding. Business discontinued. Business 4. Debt restructuring. Business closed. Business 5. Pending. Expected funding source? Richard stopped reading. Shelby Dean's inheritance. Tyler immediately shook his head. I never told investors they already had the money. No one is suggesting you did, Richard replied. You keep making it sound criminal. I'm making it sound documented. Those 4 words landed harder than an accusation. Documented. Not assumed, not exaggerated. Simply documented. Patricia reached for the memorandum herself. As she read silently, I watched her expression change. Not from anger, from confusion, then disappointment, then something much heavier. Recognition. She looked at Tyler. When did you tell investors this money was coming? Tyler answered without looking at her. A couple of months ago. A couple of months. She stopped. Your grandmother was still alive. He nodded once. You already expected Shelby's inheritance before your grandmother even passed away. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. I assumed... Patricia interrupted him. No. Her voice wasn't loud. It was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Don't tell me what you assumed. She placed the memorandum on the table. Tell me why. Tyler finally looked up. Because every other time the family helped. Nobody answered. He continued. I honestly thought that's what families do. His words hung in the air. They weren't manipulative. They weren't angry. If anything, they sounded sincere, and somehow that hurt even more. Because he genuinely believed rescue was normal. He had lived inside that expectation for so many years that it no longer seemed unusual. Richard quietly folded another page. I believe Mrs. Dean anticipated that explanation as well. He turned to another handwritten note. If Tyler someday says he expected help because that is what our family has always done, remember, these expectations are taught. Therefore, they can also be changed. I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. Not because Grandma was proving herself right, because she had spent years trying to prevent this exact moment. She had understood every person sitting in this room. My mother wasn't greedy. She was terrified of watching her son fail. Tyler wasn't plotting to ruin my life. He genuinely believed family resources naturally flowed toward whichever crisis was loudest. Neither realization excused what had happened, but it explained it. Richard carefully closed the memorandum. There is one final document from Mr. Whitmore. He handed copies to each of us. Across the top was a title independent memorandum regarding Mrs. Eleanor Dean's estate planning intent. Samuel summarized dozens of meetings he had held with Grandma during the last 2 years of her life. He described how she repeatedly emphasized one objective: protect Shelby from coercion. Not because Shelby was weak, because Shelby was the least likely person to defend herself against family pressure. I stared at that sentence. It felt strangely accurate. At work, I challenged executives when compliance rules were ignored. I questioned million-dollar transactions without hesitation. Yet around my own family, I apologized for saying no before I'd even said it. Samuel's final paragraph explained why Grandma requested the memorandum be notarized. She wanted an independent professional, not a family member, to confirm her intentions if they were ever questioned. Richard turned the last page toward us. The notary seal gleamed beneath Samuel's signature. Patricia wiped her eyes. I don't think I knew my own family anymore, Richard answered gently. I think Mrs. Dean hoped this process would allow everyone to know it more honestly. Before anyone could respond, Richard's assistant knocked softly on the conference room door. Mr. Lawson. Yes. She stepped inside, holding a small envelope. This was just delivered by courier. Richard frowned. I wasn't expecting anything. Neither was anyone else. The envelope was addressed in neat block letters. To be added to the estate file if delivered before closing. The sender's name made Richard pause. Samuel Whitmore, Grandma Eleanor's accountant. Richard looked at the date on the courier receipt. It was mailed 3 days ago. He carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single flash drive and a handwritten note. Richard read only the first line before looking up at all of us. It appears Mr. Whitmore found something after preparing the memorandum. Richard held the flash drive between 2 fingers without inserting it into his computer. I should explain what this is before anyone jumps to conclusions. Tyler let out a frustrated sigh. Please do. Richard glanced at the handwritten note that accompanied the drive. Mr. Whitmore writes that while organizing archived correspondence after completing the estate file, he located additional material that he believed belonged with Mrs. Dean's documentation. He looked around the room. He specifically states that these records came from Eleanor's personal filing cabinets, not from anyone's private accounts. That distinction mattered. As someone who worked in compliance, I immediately understood why. Evidence wasn't useful unless its origin could be trusted. Richard plugged the flash drive into his office computer. Several scanned PDF files appeared on the screen. Nothing dramatic. No hidden recordings, no secret surveillance. Just organized documents. Exactly the kind of evidence Grandma trusted. The first file was labeled Family Assistance Timeline. The second, Correspondence. The third, Personal Notes. Richard opened the correspondence folder first. Most of the letters were old. Some were handwritten. Others had been typed years earlier. Then one caught my attention. Recipient Eleanor Dean, sender Patricia Dean. Date 14 years earlier. Richard looked at my mother. Mrs. Dean asked that this letter be read only if questions remained regarding her intentions. Patricia frowned. I don't remember writing a letter. Richard enlarged the scan. At the bottom sat my mother's unmistakable signature. He began reading. Mom, he said, I know Shelby can manage without extra help for a while. She's always responsible. Tyler can't recover from another setback without us. Once he's established, we'll make things right with Shelby." Richard stopped. Nobody interrupted. He continued, "Please trust me one more time. Shelby will understand. She always does." My mother slowly lowered her eyes. She whispered the word almost to herself. "I forgot." I believed her, not because forgetting excused anything, because people rarely remember every promise they make over decades. Grandma apparently did. Richard opened another letter. 5 years later, same handwriting, same pattern, another request, another emergency, another assurance that Shelby would understand, then another, and another. The wording changed. The reasoning changed. The outcome never did. Each letter contained some version of the same belief. Shelby is strong enough. Shelby will be okay. We'll help her later. Later never came. Patricia quietly covered her face. "I kept thinking there would be a better time." Richard nodded sympathetically. "Mrs. Dean addressed that as well." He found another handwritten page. "There is rarely a perfect time to be fair. Delaying fairness usually benefits the person already receiving more." Tyler pushed his chair back. "This has become a trial." Richard answered immediately, "No." "It feels like one." "A trial determines legal liability." He gently tapped the stack of papers. "This is explaining estate planning." The distinction mattered. No one was accusing Tyler of committing a crime. No one was threatening lawsuits. Grandma had simply refused to let assumptions replace documented history. Richard opened the final folder labeled Personal Notes. Unlike the previous exhibits, these weren't organized by financial transaction. They were organized by conversations. Grandma had written short observations after important family gatherings. One entry immediately caught my attention. "Christmas dinner, 8 years ago. I remembered that dinner. Tyler had announced another expansion plan. Everyone applauded. I had quietly shared that I had completed a professional certification after nearly a year of evening classes. The conversation moved on less than a minute later. Grandma's note read, Shelby smiled as though it didn't matter that no one asked about her accomplishment. I believe it mattered. I had forgotten that evening. Grandma hadn't. Another entry. Mother's Day brunch, 6 years ago. Tyler discussed unpaid taxes. Conversation lasted 42 minutes. Shelby mentioned promotion. Conversation lasted approximately 40 seconds. I wish someone had noticed. I stared at the page. The details weren't exaggerated. They weren't emotional. They were almost clinical. Grandma had simply observed. The truth was painful enough without embellishment. Patricia quietly reached for the notebook copies. As she turned each page, tears rolled down her face. I never realized. She kept repeating the sentence. I never realized. Tyler looked uncomfortable. I didn't ask people to ignore Shelby. No, I said quietly. You didn't. Everyone looked at me, but you also never stopped it. Tyler opened his mouth, then closed it, because there wasn't really an answer. Richard spoke again. Mrs. Dean included one final observation before ending her journal. He found the page. Enabling rarely begins with bad intentions, he continued. It usually begins with compassion. Another sentence. It becomes harmful when compassion is offered repeatedly without accountability. My mother nodded slowly, almost involuntarily, as though she recognized herself in every word. Richard closed the journal. I believe we've reached the end of Mrs. Dean's supporting documentation. The room remained silent. For several moments, no one seemed interested in talking. Then my cousin Melissa, who had quietly attended the meeting because she was also a beneficiary of a small keepsake, finally spoke. "I need to say something." Everyone turned toward her. "I loaned Tyler $20,000 4 years ago." Tyler immediately looked surprised. "Melissa." She held up a hand. "I'm not trying to embarrass you." She looked at me instead. "I never told anyone because I thought you'd judge me." "I wouldn't. I know that now." She took a slow breath. "I was never repaid." Another voice spoke from the other side of the room. It was Uncle David. "I helped with $15,000 after the food truck failed." He looked embarrassed. "I told everyone it was an investment." He forced a sad smile. "It wasn't." Then Aunt Karen quietly added, "I paid one of Tyler's credit card settlements." The room shifted, not dramatically, quietly. One by one, relatives admitted they had stepped in over the years. Some had loaned money. Some had paid bills directly. Some had co-signed obligations they later regretted. Most had never mentioned it because they assumed they were the only ones. Grandma had known otherwise. She had simply never exposed anyone while she was alive. Tyler looked around the room. His confidence disappeared with every confession. Finally, he stood. So everybody's just piling on now." "No," Uncle David answered calmly. "We're finally comparing notes." That sentence changed everything. Because for years, each rescue had existed in isolation. Now everyone could finally see the entire picture. Tyler looked toward my mother. "You aren't going to say anything." Patricia slowly stood as well. She looked at her son with tears still on her face. "I don't know what to say." "You could defend me." She shook her head. "I've been defending you for most of your life." Tyler's jaw tightened. "You make that sound like a bad thing." Patricia answered with heartbreaking honesty. "I don't know anymore." Tyler looked around the room one last time. Then his frustration finally boiled over. "I only expected Shelby's inheritance because everyone always made sure I landed on my feet." The words echoed through Richard's conference room. The moment they left his mouth, Tyler froze. He realized exactly what he had admitted. No one needed Grandma's journals to explain the family pattern anymore. Tyler had explained it himself. No one reacted immediately. Tyler's own words seemed to hang in the conference room long after he stopped speaking. "I only expected Shelby's inheritance because everyone always made sure I landed on my feet." He looked from face to face as though waiting for someone to explain why that statement wasn't as bad as it suddenly sounded. No one did. My mother slowly sat back down. For the first time in my life, she didn't rush to rescue him. Richard quietly closed the last folder. "I believe Mrs. Dean hoped everyone would eventually arrive at this realization on their own." Tyler rubbed his forehead. "So what now?" Richard answered simply. "Now probate continues." "There has to be something Shelby can do." I finally spoke. "There is." Everyone looked at me. "I can decide what happens to my inheritance." Tyler nodded quickly. "Exactly." "No." I shook my head. "I mean, I decide. Not because I'm pressured. Not because I'm guilty. Not because everyone expects it." His shoulders dropped. The certainty he'd carried into the meeting was gone. Richard stood. "I recommend we adjourn for today." No one argued. The estate documents were carefully returned to their folders. Everyone gathered their belongings in silence. As we walked toward the parking lot, my mother caught my arm. "Can we talk?" I looked at Ethan. He gave me a small nod before walking toward our car. "I'll wait." My mother and I stood beside the sidewalk outside Richard's office. The afternoon sun was warm, but neither of us seemed to notice. Patricia looked smaller than she had that morning. "I owe you an apology." I waited. She took a long breath. I honestly believed I was protecting both of my children. I know. I never wanted you to feel less important. I know. She looked surprised. You do. I believe your intentions. She looked relieved. Then I continued. But intentions don't erase outcomes. She closed her eyes for a moment. I've been hearing your grandmother's voice all afternoon. So have I. I keep remembering all the times she told me Tyler needed consequences. She laughed bitterly. I always thought consequences could wait until after the next crisis. I nodded. There was always another crisis. She wiped her eyes. I thought love meant never letting him fail. I answered carefully. Sometimes love means letting someone experience the results of their own decisions. She didn't disagree. Instead, she quietly asked, Are you going to help him? I considered the question for several seconds. Then I answered honestly, I'm not giving Tyler my inheritance. She looked disappointed, but she didn't argue. I'm also not celebrating his failure. That seemed to confuse her. I don't understand. I don't want him to lose because I refused him. She waited. I want him to succeed because he built something sustainable. She looked away. I don't know if he can. I don't know either. We stood quietly for another minute before she hugged me. It wasn't the kind of dramatic embrace that erased decades of hurt. It was awkward, careful, almost uncertain. For the first time, it felt honest. 3 days later, Natalie Brooks called me. I've reviewed every document Richard sent. What do you think? I think your grandmother was exceptionally organized. I smiled. That sounds like Grandma. She laughed softly. It also means there's almost nothing anyone can successfully challenge. So the estate is secure. Very. She paused. There is something else. What? I became curious after reading Tyler's operating agreement. I leaned back in my chair. What did you find? Nothing confidential. She emphasized those words. Everything came from public records. Okay. I searched the state court database. My stomach tightened. There are currently 2 civil lawsuits involving Tyler's company. I blinked. What? They aren't enormous. What are they about? One supplier claims invoices haven't been paid, and the other, a marketing contractor, alleges breach of contract. Neither case had been decided. Neither proved wrongdoing, but together they painted a troubling picture. Natalie continued. I also reviewed the annual reports filed with the state. What did they show? The company is operating with significantly less capital than investors were apparently led to expect. I remembered the operating agreement. Expected family capital contribution. I think, Natalie said carefully, your inheritance became part of Tyler's business plan long before anyone asked for your permission. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my home office for nearly an hour. Not because I was angry, because I was finally seeing the full picture. The inheritance wasn't supposed to rescue an emergency. It had already been spent on paper. Just not by me. That evening, Ethan found me staring out the kitchen window. You've been awfully quiet. I keep thinking about something. What? If I had said yes immediately, he didn't interrupt. I wouldn't have been helping Tyler. What would you have been doing? I would have been repairing assumptions. He smiled gently. I think your grandmother would agree. I nodded. I think so too. A week later, Tyler called. It was the first time we'd spoken since the estate meeting. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Hi. His voice sounded different, less confident. I know you're probably not interested in hearing from me. I'm listening. He was quiet for several seconds. I lost 2 investors. I'm sorry. I thought you might say that. I am sorry, he sighed. They found out the inheritance wasn't available. I didn't ask how. It no longer mattered. They pulled out. I'm sorry your business is struggling. Another silence. Then he asked the question I'd been expecting. So that's it? What do you mean? Oh, you're really not helping. I chose my words carefully. I won't finance your company. He laughed once, a tired laugh. I guess Grandma really won. I looked at the framed photograph of Grandma Eleanor sitting on the bookshelf beside my desk. No. I said it quietly. Grandma wasn't trying to beat you. What? She was trying to stop our family from repeating the same mistake. Tyler didn't respond. Before ending the call, he said something I hadn't expected. Mom knows about the lawsuits now. I frowned. She does. Yeah. What did she say? He let out a slow breath. She told me she loves me. I waited. And then she said she wasn't writing another check. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about those words. Not because they solved everything, they didn't, but because they were something our family had never managed before. Love without another rescue. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Can we meet tomorrow? Just the two of us. There are things I should have told you years ago. I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone down. For the first time since Grandma's funeral, I believed the next conversation wouldn't be about money at all. The next afternoon, I met my mother at the small park across the street from St. Matthew's Church. Grandma Eleanor used to bring me there after Sunday services when I was little. She always packed peanut butter sandwiches in wax paper, even though we lived only 15 minutes away. She said benches under old oak trees were better places for difficult conversations than kitchen tables. I understood what she meant now. My mother was already sitting on one of those benches when I arrived. She wasn't dressed the way she usually was, no carefully chosen jewelry, no makeup beyond what she'd hurriedly applied that morning. She looked like someone who hadn't slept much. I sat beside her. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, she handed me a folded sheet of paper. I found this after I went home. I unfolded it. It was a photocopy of one of Grandma Eleanor's handwritten journal pages. Unlike the exhibits Richard had read aloud, this page hadn't been included in the estate package. Across the top, Grandma had written only the date. 8 years earlier. Below it was a short paragraph. Patricia cried today after Tyler asked for money again. She said she no longer knows whether she is helping him or protecting herself from watching him fail. I looked up. You kept this? She nodded. Your grandmother gave it to me. The day she wrote it. What happened? My mother looked toward the church across the street. She invited me to lunch. I could almost picture it. The two of them sitting in Grandma's favorite booth at the neighborhood diner. Coffee growing cold while neither wanted to begin the difficult conversation. She asked me one question. What was it? If Tyler were someone else's son, would you still think giving him more money was helping him? Mom smiled sadly. I couldn't answer. I folded the page carefully. What did you tell her? I changed the subject. That sounded painfully familiar. Grandma had spent years asking direct questions. Our family had become experts at avoiding direct answers. Mom took a slow breath. I need you to know something. I waited. I wasn't choosing Tyler because I loved you less. I believe you. I was choosing the child I thought couldn't survive without me. She looked down at her hands. I didn't realize what that choice was doing to the child who already believed she had to survive alone. Neither of us spoke for a while. The breeze moved gently through the oak trees overhead. Somewhere across the park, children laughed on the playground. Life continued around us. Quietly, ordinarily, exactly the way it always does, even after families change forever. My mother broke the silence. Do you remember your promotion? I smiled faintly. The compliance manager position? She nodded. I remember calling you. You sounded happy. I was. I laughed softly. You also spent most of the call talking about Tyler's tax problems? Tears filled her eyes immediately. I know. I hadn't planned to say it. It simply came out. I celebrated with Ethan that night. I know. I don't think anyone else ever asked how it went. She covered her face. I honestly don't remember. I do. Not because I had held on to the hurt. Because small moments like that accumulate. One forgotten celebration doesn't change a relationship. Dozens of them eventually do. Mom wiped her eyes again. Your grandmother confronted me more than once. I guessed. She nodded. The first time was after your college graduation. I remembered that day clearly. Grandma had hugged me longer than anyone else. She whispered, I'm proud of the woman you've become. At the time, I thought she was simply emotional. Now I realized she had probably spent the entire afternoon arguing with my mother. Mom continued. She told me something that made me furious. What? Patricia, you're treating Shelby's independence like a family resource instead of a personal achievement. I repeated the sentence quietly. A family resource. Mom nodded. I thought she was criticizing me. She was warning you. I know that now. She looked at me with an expression I'd rarely seen before. Not guilt, humility. I spent years believing your strength gave me permission to ask more from you. I smiled sadly. And I spent years believing saying yes was how daughters earned love. Neither of us blamed the other. We simply recognized the pattern that felt different, healthier. After a while, Mom asked the question I think she'd been carrying all week. Can you ever forgive me? I answered honestly. I already have. She looked startled. You have... I forgave you before Grandma's funeral. She stared at me. Then why does everything feel so different now? Because forgiveness and access aren't the same thing. She frowned slightly. I don't understand. I don't need to stay angry to protect myself. She listened carefully. I forgive what happened. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. But I won't participate in the same pattern anymore. She nodded slowly. So if Tyler asks again, I'll still say no. And if I ask you to reconsider, I'll still say no. She smiled through her tears. I think your grandmother would like that answer. So do I. We sat together until the church bells rang 4 times. Then my mother reached into her purse one last time. I almost forgot. She handed me another envelope. This was tucked inside one of your grandmother's recipe books. Unlike the estate documents, this envelope had already been opened years earlier. Mom explained. She showed it to me once. You read it. I couldn't. Why not? She told me it wasn't for me. I carefully unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandma Eleanor's. Patricia. If Shelby ever learns the full story, please don't ask her to carry your guilt too. She has carried enough that never belonged to her. Your responsibility after I'm gone is not convincing Shelby to fix this family. Your responsibility is making sure she never again feels responsible for keeping it together. I stopped reading. The words blurred for a moment. Mom quietly said, I failed her while she was alive. She looked at me. I don't want to fail her now. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. You don't have to convince me anymore. I know. You just have to live differently. She nodded. I intend to. The next morning, Richard Lawson called. Good morning, Shelby. Morning. I wanted you to know probate has officially closed. I smiled. So, it's finished. Legally, yes. He paused. There is one last item Mrs. Dean instructed me to deliver personally. What is it? A sealed envelope. I laughed softly. She certainly loved sealed envelopes. Richard chuckled. She did. This one has your name on it. Only mine, only yours. He became quiet for a moment. And according to her instructions, I'm not allowed to tell you what's inside until you pick it up. The next morning, I drove to Richard Lawson's office with a strange sense of calm. For weeks, every visit to that building had carried tension, questions, documents, confrontations. This time felt different. Probate had officially closed. No one could challenge the distribution anymore. No one could ask Richard to reconsider Grandma Eleanor's instructions. The legal process was finished. What remained was personal. Richard greeted me with a warm smile. I've been expecting you. I figured Grandma probably scheduled this too. He laughed. She certainly tried to think of everything. We walked into his office instead of the conference room. The long table where our family had argued sat empty now. No stacks of evidence, no folders, no raised voices, just quiet. Richard opened his desk drawer and removed a small cream-colored envelope. Across the front in Grandma Eleanor's familiar handwriting were 3 simple words. For Shelby only. He handed it to me. Mrs. Dean instructed me not to remain in the room while you read it. I nodded. Thank you. He paused at the doorway. Your grandmother trusted your judgment more than almost anyone I've ever represented. Then he quietly left, closing the door behind him. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Nothing else. No legal documents. No hidden accounts. No surprise inheritance. Just Grandma. Her handwriting filled both sides of one page. My dearest Shelby, if you are reading this, then you have already survived the hardest part. Not the legal paperwork, not the arguments. The hardest part was learning that people can love you deeply while still asking too much from you. I hope you never mistake that truth for bitterness. People are complicated. Your mother loves both of her children. She simply spent too many years believing love meant preventing pain instead of preparing someone to face it. Please don't spend your life punishing her for that. But don't repeat it either. You have something our family has struggled to understand. You know the difference between compassion and responsibility. Never lose that. Money was never the real inheritance I wanted to leave you. Money disappears. Wisdom does not. Boundaries do not. Self-respect does not. If keeping this inheritance causes someone to think less of you, remember this. Anyone who requires your sacrifice in order to approve of you was never protecting your future. Please use this money to build something that reflects your values instead of repairing mistakes that belong to someone else. That would make me very proud. And one more thing. Stop apologizing every time you say no. Love Grandma Eleanor. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. By the end, I wasn't crying because of the inheritance. I was crying because someone had finally given me permission to stop earning my place in my own family. Richard knocked softly before reopening the door. You all right? I smiled. I think I finally am. He nodded as though he'd expected that answer. I hoped you would be. 6 months later, my life looked surprisingly ordinary. And that was exactly what peace felt like. Instead of constantly wondering when the next family emergency would arrive, Ethan and I finally focused on our own future. We paid off the remaining balance on our mortgage years ahead of schedule. We rebuilt our emergency savings after setting aside a portion of the inheritance for long-term investments. Then I used another portion to create something Grandma would have appreciated. Working with a local community foundation, I established the Eleanor Dean Financial Responsibility Scholarship. It wasn't a large scholarship. It didn't need to be. Each year, it would help first-generation college students studying accounting, finance, business ethics, or public administration students who demonstrated financial responsibility despite limited family resources. The scholarship committee loved the idea. So did Ethan. "It sounds exactly like your grandmother," he said the day we signed the paperwork. "It feels like her." At the dedication ceremony, I placed Grandma's favorite photograph beside a bouquet of white lilies. There were no speeches about family conflict, only gratitude, only hope. Tyler didn't attend. He called me the following week instead. "I heard about the scholarship." "Yeah. It was a good idea." "Thank you." There was a long pause. "My company didn't make it." "I'm sorry. I am too." His voice sounded older somehow, not defeated, just honest. "I finally got a job." "What kind?" "Operations manager at a manufacturing company." "How do you like it?" He laughed. "I forgot what it feels like to work for somebody else." "And it's actually kind of nice." I smiled. "Stability has its advantages." "It does." Another silence. Then he surprised me. "I owe a lot of people apologies." "You don't have to do them all at once." "I know." He hesitated. "I've already started." When we ended the call, I realized it was the first conversation we'd ever had that wasn't about rescuing him or defending myself. It was simply two adults talking. That felt like progress. My relationship with Mom changed more slowly. Trust doesn't return because someone says they're sorry. It returns through consistency. She stopped asking me to solve Tyler's financial problems. She stopped treating my stability as an unlimited resource. When Tyler struggled at first with his new job, she listened. She encouraged him. She made dinner for him. But she didn't write another check. Months later, she admitted something over coffee. This is harder than I expected. What is? Watching him solve his own problems. I smiled gently. I imagine it is. But, she looked out the cafe window. He seems more confident now than he ever did when I kept rescuing him. I thought Grandma would have smiled hearing that. The greatest surprise wasn't that our family became perfect. It didn't. We still disagreed. Old habits occasionally resurfaced. Some conversations remained uncomfortable. Healing, I learned, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of healthier patterns. On the first anniversary of Grandma Eleanor's passing, our family gathered at her favorite park after church. The same oak trees stood quietly over the benches. Children still laughed on the playground. The world had continued exactly as she knew it would. Mom handed me a small mason jar. Inside were sunflower seeds. Grandma planted them every spring. I thought maybe you'd like to keep the tradition going, she said. I smiled. I'd love that. As we walked through the garden together, I realized Grandma's greatest gift had never been the money she left behind. It wasn't even the carefully organized evidence that protected me. It was the permission to believe that love and boundaries could exist at the same time. For most of my life, I thought saying no would cost me my family. Instead, it gave my family the first real chance to change. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives in a neatly labeled folder. Sometimes it arrives in a handwritten letter. And sometimes it begins the moment someone finally believes they no longer have to sacrifice themselves to deserve love. The hardest part of recovering from family manipulation isn't learning how to say no. It's believing you have the right to say it without carrying lifelong guilt. Many people who are seen as the dependable one become the quiet solution to everyone else's problems, often without realizing how much they have sacrificed until years later. Healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. They are acts of responsibility both to yourself and to the people you love. Real accountability gives others the opportunity to grow, while constant rescue can unintentionally prevent that growth. If you've ever felt pressured to give more simply because you were considered the responsible one, know that protecting your future does not mean you love your family any less. Forgiveness can free your heart from resentment, but it does not require restoring unlimited access to your time, your finances, or your peace of mind. Those are separate choices, and both deserve careful thought. I'd love to hear your perspective. Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with someone you loved? What did you learn from that experience? Share your story in the comments, because someone else reading it may need that encouragement today. And if stories like Shelby's remind you that wisdom, evidence, and quiet courage can overcome manipulation, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined us for future stories. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.